We found this particular book in the public domain, public access. No copyright infringement was intentional. And this book is titled History of the Syrian Nation and the Old Evangelical Apostolic Church of the East, from remote antiquity to the present time, roughly, by Professor George David Malech of Urmia, Persia. After his death, edited with numerous pictures and illustrations by his son, the Reverend Nestorius George Malech, Archdeacon. And there he is pictured there, Professor George David Malech. And the author has dedicated this book to his long dead departed father. Preface. And here's a picture of Reverend Nestorius George Malech, Archdeacon. The author of this book, according to this author, is his dear, highly beloved and blessed long departed father, Professor George David Malech. Up to this particular time, of the writing of this book probably, there has not existed a history of the Syrian nation and church, although good material for such a work was in existence. And his father, seeing the necessity for such a work for the benefit of his own people and church, felt a great desire to remedy this want and write a history of his own nation and church. For a long time he had made preparations, and during the last 15 years of his life he was occupied in producing this work. When the manuscript was ready, he decided to go with his son to America to get the work printed in Syriac for the Syrians and in English for the benefit of the Christians in the West, to give them information about the Syrians, their church and their work for Christ, and the great and bloody persecutions they have gone through for the love of Christ and the confessing of his holy name. They left their home in the city of Urmia, Persia, May 27th, 1909, and on the road they met with a serious accident which caused the death of his beloved father. They had a runaway on those rugged and almost impassable roads. His father, his sister and himself were thrown out of the wagon and got hurt. His sister and himself but slightly, but his father got a shock in the head from which he died in the city of Tiflis, Russia, on the 15th of June 1909. His last words were, "My dear son, go on, continue this work. God will help you and open up the way for you." He did as his dear father commanded him with faith in the Lord, and he arrived in Chicago, Illinois, USA. He spoke to his friends about this matter, and they advised him to show the manuscript to learned men, those in the note, in the higher institutions of learning, and get their judgment concerning his book. He followed their advice, and he had shown the manuscript to specialists in Oriental law, such as Professor Dr. Lukenbill of the University of Chicago in that period, who kept and inspected the manuscript for several weeks. Professor Dr. Olaf Toftin of the Western Theology Seminary, Chicago, President A.W. Harris, and Professor Dr. Eisenline of the Northwestern University, Evanston, Illinois, and other learned doctors in Chicago. These highly esteemed and learned gentlemen, who were well qualified to pronounce judgment on that matter, in this matter, declared his book to be of great value to Semitic scholars, historians, and educated people generally, and expressed their desire to see it printed and made accessible to the English-speaking world. The testimonies of these honourable doctors are printed within this volume. The original manuscript is written in the modern Syriac, his native language, and not knowing the English sufficiently, the author translated it into the Norwegian, which he knew better, and he was so successful as to secure the aid of a learned lady, Miss Ingeborg Rasmussen, MD of Chicago, to translate it into good English, and another educated lady, Miss Cherry M. Sly, also of Chicago, had done the stenographic work. To both ladies mentioned, he gives us expressed thanks, and he continues on referring to different people that helped him, and In conclusion, he especially extols and praises the name and goodness of our Heavenly Father, who so graciously opened the way for him among the good people in the Western world, and caused the wish and command of his blessed Father to be realized in the publication of his book in the beautiful world language of the English-speaking nations. And the author commended this literary treasure from the Eastern world to the just judgment and favourable reception of all the elucidated and intelligent people who speak and understand English, with the prayer that they would buy it, read it, study it, and thus learn to know how their brethren and sisters in Christ, our Saviour, among the Syrians, have suffered, prayed, and died for the confession of his glorious name. And he asks people to do this as his friends, etc., etc. And the God's wonderful guidance and grace, this wish may also, he is hoping that the wish would also be realised. The story is George Malech, Archdeacon, Minneapolis, Minnesota, October 26, 1910. A short biography of Professor Malech. Professor George David Malech, the author of this book, was born in the year 1837 of Syrian parents in the village of Supergan in the province of Azerbaijan in northwestern Persia, and lived to be 72 years of age. He belonged to an excellent family, one of the foremost of his nation, and had the advantages of a good education. He studied theology at the mission college at Syria and graduated in the year 1855. He became a true Christian while he was at school, and in more than 50 years he was occupied with work for the kingdom of God as a preacher and teacher. He worked in the province of Salmas and in the cities of Isfahan, Tabriz, and Tehran, the capital of Persia, in Afghanistan, and many other places in Persia and elsewhere. For several years he was a professor of Oriental languages and literature at the Presbyterian Mission College in Urmia. He had made extensive journeys to preach the gospel of Christ and work for the true welfare of mankind. Thus he visited the ruins of Babylon and Nineveh, the far-off India, and even Norway, where he made many friends, and afterwards he sent his son, the editor of this volume, to Christiania, Norway, to get a good Christian education and become qualified for mission work. Professor Malech was a gifted man, and during his long and useful life he had acquired an extensive and thorough knowledge of many languages, Oriental and Occidental, and besides he was practical and tried always to use his great knowledge and experience for the benefit of his fellow men, and on that account he was highly esteemed and loved by all who learned to know him, not only the Christians but the Jews and Mohammedans as well. On account of his honesty, his love of truth, and his impartiality, his practical and theoretical wisdom, and his profound knowledge of law, the Christian and the Mohammedan, he was greatly sought as an advocate and a judge. His judgment was appealed to, and his decision was regarded as final. He had written a Synhados, or law book, for the Syrians, and at an annual meeting of the Presbyterian Church he was, as a distinction of honour, chosen unanimously a member of their legal committees for life. His knowledge and his Christian and human virtues made him his home like the home of a patriarch. In the last 15 years of his life he felt that his strength began to decline, and he did not like to have his knowledge buried with him, but as a good and wise man he desired to serve his fellow man by the precious gifts God had given him, and therefore he, through a diligent use of his time, succeeded in writing 3 great literary works, to wit: 1. The law book mentioned for his own people; 2. The present history of his own nation and church; 3. A great work on the history of Persia. Intending to get these last works translated and printed in this country, probably in America, he left his home in Urmia, Persia, in company with his son, Reverend N.G. Malech, and his daughter, Sarah, on the 27th of May 1909. And close by the boundary line between Persia and Russia, they met with a serious accident, which we already mentioned, which caused the death of Professor Malech. The horses ran away, and Professor Malech's son and daughter were thrown off the wagon, and Professor Malech got a shock in the head, from which he died in a hospital in the city of Tiflis in the Russian Caucasus on the 15th of June 1909, which you already mentioned. And he goes on about that. And blessed be the memory of Professor Malech. Mar Ephraim, the bishop of the Syrian Evangelical Apostolic Church at Urmia, Persia, September 1st, 1910. Introduction. The original manuscript of this history of the Syrian nation and church is written by Professor George David Malech in the modern Syriac language, and when it was translated into English and typewritten, the Reverend G.N. Malech asked this particular person, Reverend A.H. Jeffrey, Grand Meadow, Minnesota, to revise the whole work and correct errors and misprints, so that the translation might become a faithful a rendering of the original as possible. But this required a careful and conscientious work, because the original was written by a very learned man, has quotations from sources in different Oriental languages, and contained a great amount of difficult personal and geographical names, which hardly anyone can write correctly unless he is able to read the original manuscript in Syriac and also understands the Arabic language. He would not have taken upon him this great and difficult task had it not been for the reason that he knew that this historical work would be welcomed by Oriental scholars, historians, and educated people generally, as it would be a source from which historians could draw, since Professor Malech had the opportunity to get hold of historical documents which have been hidden to the Western world. And personally, this particular person wished to see that that literary production on which Professor Malech had been working for 15 years should not be buried with him, but came to the light and serve as a monument to perpetuate the memory of the learned author, whose noble and warm-hearted Christian personality had been a shining light in Western Persia. But it was not easy for this person to do this revision work, besides to work in his congregations. It was by no means easy to edit a posthumous literary work like this. He had always tried to do justice to the venerable departed author, and so forth. And that's from A.H.G. M.A. Grand Meadow, Minnesota, October 13th, 1910. There's a contents page. It's quite extensive. Subjects like general information about the sons of men, about the habitation of the sons of Noah, about the habitation of the children of Shem, the religion of the Arameans, Assyrians, and Chaldeans, and it continues. On the other page it has chapters about the 8th century of the Syrian church, the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, and so on. Chapter 36, Appendix, Zoroaster, his religion and his adherents, the Magi, and so forth. List of illustrations on the left. Introduction. All national histories have been drawn from two sources. The first are the writings on paper, the second the hieroglyphics on stones and plates of baked clay, though there are many parts of the national histories which have no other source except tradition and superstition. The first and most authentic source of these writings is Old Testament history, which is the divine speech of God written by his holy prophets. Almost every nation and kingdom has its own history, and so the Assyrian nation also had their own historical books, emphatically written and descriptive in detail. On account of the frequent persecutions of their hateful and powerful enemies, who carried on their plunders and massacres in a merciless manner, their hands were almost empty on the subject. By these people, thousands and tens of thousands of copies of our honourable ancestors, or the Syrian ancestors, writings had been burned. Of these were some doctrinal books and various historical and precious works about the birth, origin, and conditions of the Syrians, and about the powerful kingdom Therefore, it was very difficult to find the first and true sources of their national history from the writings of their fathers or their forefathers. But again, in spite of all the damages and losses sustained by these barbarous and cruel enemies, praise be to the Lord, the most true and first source of all other common writings is the Old Testament, which tells all about the first ancestors of the Syrians, their kingdom and their condition. This subject has other sources of information found in the ruins of Beth Naren, where Victor N. Alexander, the translator of the original ancient very old Tab Ashret, Lishana Articus Saprea, sacred scribal language of God, Old Testament and the Galilean Aramaic New Testament into the nearest English equivalent, comes from in Syria, which was the cradle of mankind. Mesopotamia was the cradle of mankind, not Egypt. The first and general inhabitants of that land were Semites, Arameans, Babylonians and Assyrians, which were the first true ancestors of the Syrians. Stones and plates of the Assyrians were for thousands of years hidden in that cradle and peacefully keeping the history of that nation. On the other side, some learned and honourable persons from Europe and America, who, having given them great occasion for thanking them on account of their great efforts, expenditure of money and sacrifice occasioned by long journeys from their own countries, facing trouble and overcoming difficulties, to Beth Naren, Mesopotamia, Turkey, excavated and dug in the ruins of Babylon, Nineveh and Shushan, and discovered the hidden historical treasures of writings and engravings upon stones, monuments, plates and bricks, which related the conditions of the first ancestors of the Syrian nation. They are almost synonymous with the holy history of the Old Testament, and especially is this true of some of the sentences and remarks of the Greek and Arabian authors in testifying concerning the antiquity of that nation, Syria. Again, there are some short articles from their own honourable Syrian ancestors which are at hand and tell about the generations of Shem, from whom the Syrian nation is descended. These ancestors are Jacob from Ur-hai, Ephraim, Ma-Ishu of Basra, Elias ba Shinachi, Gregorius ba Hebraus, Shimon ba Kaja Babai ba Nizbani, Yosef Kazatya, Ma-Merota, Bishop of Mifrekot, etc. Chapter 1. General information about the sons of men, about the habitation of the sons of Noah. Genesis tells us plainly that the sons of Noah, after the flood, immigrated from the east. They found a beautiful land in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. Genesis 11:2. Later they became divided into three great branches: Japhethites, Shemites and Hamites. After the division of languages, their children were scattered on the face of the known earth of that day. Japhethites immigrated and settled northwest of their first place of habitation and dwelt in the lands near by the Caspian and the Black Seas, and in part of Asia Minor and all Europe, and thus they removed themselves far away from the cradle of mankind, or Mesopotamia, where they could have been brought up in all piety and religious conviction. Instead, they sank into deep and degraded heathendom. Hamites also became scattered into southeastern lands from this first habitation. They occupied Babylon, Canaan, southern Arabia and Africa. These also sank into darkness of ignorance and worshipped idols. The Shemites immigrated southeast from their land and dwelt in Assyria, Arabia, and in the inner part of Asia proper, which is the centre of mankind and the best land in Asia. About the habitation of the children of Shem. Elam, the first son of Shem, went to the south of Fars, Persia. Ashur, the second son of Shem, went and built Nineveh, and that country was named after him. And his footnote indicated down below. One Semitic philologists assert that Genesis 10:11 teaches that Nimrod was the founder of Nineveh. He went out from the land of Babylon to Ashur and built Nineveh. Editor. And this is the great ancestor of the translator of the Aramaic Old Testament scriptures, manuscripts, and Galilean Aramaic New Testament manuscripts, scriptures, Victor and Alexander. His middle name is Nimrod, probably named after his grandfather and his grandfather before him, etc., etc. So he's a descendant, according to him, of Nimrod, or Nimrod. Okay, so Pashkad, the third son of Shem, dwelt near the Mount of Ararat. During this time, 2 sons were born to his grandson Eber. In your modern Bible version, it might have an H in front of it, Heber. Their names were Peleg and Joktan. In the days of Peleg, the land was divided. Genesis 10:25. Joktan and his sons dwelt in the lands located between the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. Peleg and his sons dwelt near to the joint of a river which flowed into the Euphrates. Okay, from the Genesis, or the Aramaic Brita, Genesis in English, it doesn't really tell you where they were as far as we can remember, but they're all eventually, like, Abraham came from them. He was born in Ur of Chaldea in Mesopotamia, Syria. So they probably all migrated from somewhere else and lived there, and Abraham was born, and then they eventually moved to Canaan, the promised land. Something along those lines. Lud, the fourth son, went to Asia Minor and dwelt there and became known as the father of the Lydians. Aram, the first son, remained in Mesopotamia, Beth Naren. That land was called after his name. Genesis 24:10, 25:20, 31:8, Judges 8, Acts 2:9. So we see that all these people, though one tribe, one nation, descended from one father, Shem, but on account of the various habitations in their respective countries, or the geographical locations at that time, they are called Aramaeans, Assyrians, and Chaldeans. But they ought to be regarded as one nation. Chapter 2. The religion of the Aramaeans, Assyrians, and Chaldeans. In the beginning, there were two popular religions among all people of the human race. First, the religion of the patriarchs, worshipping the true God, which began from Adam, the first father of mankind, and a narrow way was extended to Noah, and from Noah as a thin thread became extended to Abraham and Moses at the Mount of Sinai. The second, the rest of mankind, which were in the majority, were idolaters. They used to worship various creatures and elements. The Assyrians, Aramaeans, Chaldeans, and heathen were idolaters, and they had many gods, varying in material, shape, form, construction, and services attributed to them by their ignorant worshippers. The Chaldeans, or early Babylonians, used to worship the great light, the sun. The Syrians also learned from them to worship the sun. The Chaldeans, in the days of their king Nebuchadnezzar, had a greater god than all the others which they possessed. Its name was Bel. He had an image of man, but was very ugly. He had a human costume as dress. On his head he had a golden crown with horns. He had a temple which was constructed upon the tower and early ruins of Babylon. It covered a place of 180 square yards of ground, and also 180 yards high. It was 8 stories high. There was a carriage way around it in a spiral form, so that people could ride in carriages and drive to the top of this temple. The highest story, the 8th, was the office and the dwelling place of Bel, that pagan god. In that story was a bed and a golden table. In the lowest story of the temple was the picture of Bel, a golden table and a golden throne, the price of which would amount to $1 million, possibly $1 million today. Every year, $1 million of frankincense was burned on the altar of the temple. There were many images in it, and the height of every one was 12 yards, and they were of solid gold. In this very temple, Nebuchadnezzar, and it looks like there's a statue of him there. There's a statue of Nebo from Nimrod, British Museum, Calcarea stone, height 6 feet 5 inches. Okay, so past the golden vessels which he had brought from Solomon's temple in the time of Jerusalem's captivity. Okay, that does not sound like a right sentence, so we're going to go back and check that. In this very temple, Nebuchadnezzar put the golden vessels which he had brought from Solomon's temple in the time of Jerusalem's captivity. The Assyrians also had many gods which they used to worship, but the greatest of all was Ashur, which was named after their first father. Okay, sometimes you see it spelt in the modern Bible as Asher. This may be the original Syrian. Yeah, it probably is, because the Greek don't have the sh sound in their language, so they would spell it as A-S-S-U-R, probably. They used to entitle him the King of Gods and the highest tribunal in judgment, the one who gives the crown, the hero who gives victory, and the protector of righteous people. He had a temple in the city of Ashur, which was called the Mountain of the World. This temple was the greatest and most popular place of worship for the Assyrians during the entire period of their national existence. Again, Ashur and Bel, in their devilish and hellish cooperation, jointly produced 12 lower gods to which respectively a special service was committed. Anu was to supply the need, Nisroch was the king of water, Ben was the one who assisted the water to flow and a raiser of fruits, Adar Shamdan was the hero of war and a god who conquers the enemies, Nebo was the protector of heaven, Baalat, the wife of Bel, was the mother of great gods, Nugal was supervisor, superintendent and general commander of war, Bel Dagon was the creator of the world, Shamash was ordained deacon of God, supervisor of heaven and earth as the special representative of God, Istar or Istarot, god of heaven and earth, and female god of war and love. Ashur and Bel did not have temples only in Ashur and Babylon, but they had temples also in other large cities of their own respective countries of their own kingdoms. The people of that time thought that the world was full of spirits, some of which were dwelling in the very depth of the earth, and the others in water, and yet some others in the air. And they thought that some of them were good and some were evil. They used to imagine that the evil spirits were horrible, and they used to embody them with a human form upon which there was the crooked head of an animal such as a lion, eagle and dog. The good spirit was imagined to be in the likeness of an animal upon which there was a human image. The best image was that of an ox with wings, and these images were put in front of kings and lords. The people used to offer sacrifices of fruits and oxen and sheep to the gods, the small g. After the festivities and holidays, the people of that time used to spend some days in fastings, weeping, repentance, as the payment for their shortcomings and forgetfulness which they had committed during their festivities. The people of Nineveh used to offer human sacrifices to their gods as prisoners and strangers. The Assyrians and Babylonians did not treat their dead as did the Egyptians. They used to lament their dead and anoint them with various kinds of perfumes, and dress them and powder their faces with white powder. They used to blacken their eyes with black powder, and they put on their necks necklaces of beads and rings on their fingers. And they put the hands of the dead upon their chests, and on their sides they put frankincense, cakes and water. And some of their dead they cremated. The Chaldeans and Assyrians, though they did not reach to the knowledge of the true God, were in their own wisdom able to imagine a great and powerful God who controlled the worshippers, stars and planets. And there's Nugal's emblem, the man-lion. Chapter 3. The ancient kingdom of Babylon. Its first king was Nimrod, whose name is mentioned in Genesis 10:10. He built 3 cities, Erech, Akkad and Calneh. In this kingdom there are writings and ruins which remain until now. Well, let's hope they're still around, not being blown up by extremists. This country is in the Bible called by different names. A. Shinar, Isaiah 11:11, Daniel 1:2, Zechariah 5:11. B. The Chaldean land, Ezek. That's Ezekiel. The Chaldean land, Ezekiel 12:13, Jeremiah 24:5. C. Babylon, 2 Kings 24:1, 25:27, Psalms 137:1, Ezekiel 23:15 and 17. The generation of the Chaldeans and Babylonians. By many it is thought that the Chaldeans in the old times were dwelling in Mesopotamia, Genesis 11:28. From there they moved southward and settled near the city of Babylon. The kingdoms of Babylon came into existence by amalgamation of the Chaldeans, the sons of Shem, with the Babylonians, the sons of Ham. The boundaries of the kingdom of Babylon before the Persian invasion were the following: to the north, Beth Naren, Mesopotamia, and Syria; to the south, the Persian Gulf; to the east, Media and Persia; to the west, the Arabian desert. But in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, their king, at the climax of their development as a universal empire, this kingdom occupied the entire Bet Naren, Mesopotamia region, Persia, Syria, and Egypt. The Babylonian kingdom before Nebuchadnezzar, their first king, was not entirely independent. It was subjugated by the Assyrians, to whom they did pay tribute. Though the Babylonians had tried on many occasions to get rid of their oppressors, they did not succeed until the year 747 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar, the king, broke the bondage of their yoke and made their own country entirely independent and subjugated the Assyrians. He ruled over the Assyrians, made them his subjects. From this date until the time of Cyrus the Persian, who captured Babylon, this kingdom was an empire for the length of 87 years. Nebuchadnezzar, the first king, reigned from 747 BC to 733. Nadinas, the second king, reigned from 733 BC to 731, and it goes on listing more kings, and it finally gets to the seventh king, who was Nebuchadnezzar. He governed from 604 to 361 BC. He fought against Phoenicia, Egypt, Palestine, captured Jerusalem, and destroyed the kingdom of Judah. So there was this Palestine in that era. Probably not the actual name, because supposedly that's a name given by the Romans at a later century. He captured the city of Syria in 585 BC. He became the lord of Arabia and Egypt in 570 BC. In his conquest, he joined many of the small kingdoms into one kingdom, and he organized the conquered lands into an empire, and he received the title of the King of Kings, Daniel 2:7. The age of the captivity is counted from the time that Nebuchadnezzar captured the city of Jerusalem, plundered the temple of Solomon, and brought the Jews as captives to Babylon, which took place in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, until the returning of the Jews under the superintendency of Zerubbabel and Ezra, the high priest, to build the temple and Jerusalem. The length of the captivity was 7 years. And there's a relief there, stone relief, Meradak or Marduk Eden Aki, from a basalt stele in the British Museum, height 24 inches. And there's more history on the kingdom of Judah, 3 times overthrown by Nebuchadnezzar the king, and so forth. And it's got down here the Jewish captives were opposed very much by the lords, the Babylonians. Nebuchadnezzar died in the year 561 BC. Okay, some other king ruled and he was killed by his brother-in-law. And it carries on like that. Country of the Babylonians. Babylon was a plain without mountains, and it had a very hot climate. The lands of this country were very fertile and fruitful. It is said that the farms of wheat would bring a crop 100-fold and the barley 200-fold. The farms and the lands were watered by the rivers Euphrates and Tigris. The Holy Scriptures called Babylon the ornament of kingdoms and the praise of Chaldea. Isaiah 13:19. The city of Babylon. Babylon was founded nearby the great river Euphrates, about 200 miles above where the two rivers Euphrates and Tigris joined in one big stream, and about 300 miles above the Persian Gulf. Because where there's water, then people thrive. If there's no water, well, there's no use hanging around there. Okay, so people would go somewhere else where there's water. About 300 miles northeast from it, and about 700 miles northeast of Jerusalem, was Nineveh. There was no other city except the city of Jerusalem, about which there were so many prophecies and threats as there were about this city. In Jeremiah 51:41, Babylon is called Shishak, probably a name of one of its idols. In its size it was smaller than Nineveh, but it had more beautiful and wonderful places than that city. In the days of Nebuchadnezzar, the city was more decorated and stronger. It was built on both sides of the river Euphrates and joined together by a bridge, very wonderful in its fine construction, considering that day and age, and so forth. And it goes into the science and arts of the Babylonians and the Babylonian king's chronology. The first great history of the Chaldeans commenced 2234 years BC. The second organization of the kingdom was 625 years BC. The order of their kings is as follows. It goes from Nebuchadnezzar, who reigned in 747 to 733 BC, down to Nabonidus, who reigned 555 to 538 BC. Chapter 4, the Syrian kingdom. The country of Assyria, like Babylonia, lays between two great rivers, Euphrates and Tigris. So that's what that kingdom means in their language. And the history had two divisions. One at the beginning of the kingdom, see Genesis 10:11, saying, Ashur came from the land of Shinar, built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calah, Rezin, between Nineveh and Calah. This reign continued to the year of 1250 BC. The second division from 1250 BC to the year 625 BC. The first king, Ashur, the son of Shem, founded Nineveh, and he is called by some other name also, Belus. It is possible that this name was given him after his death because the Syrians came to know him as their god. The second king was Ninus. Some of the ancients think that it was he who built Nineveh, but the real builder of Nineveh was Ashur. But it may be that Ninus rebuilt it, therefore the city was called after his name. The third king was Shamarosk. The fourth king was Arioch, the king of Elasar, according to Genesis, and so forth. Ashurbanipal succeeded Tiglath-Pileser, the king. In his reign, the kingdom of Assyria was in peace with the rest of the world. After this king, his brother Shamishbin the second reigned 14 years only. Assurbanipal succeeded to the throne. In his day, the countries east of the Euphrates regained their freedom from the bondage of Assyria. This event took place at 1020 BC. Another dynasty now took the reins of the Syrian government. The first king of this dynasty was Belshazzar, and there were 7 other kings who followed him, who were weak. Yeah, they had their moments where they were strong, weak, strong, weak, weak, strong, and so forth. Ashurbanipal supposedly brought great strength to that particular country. And there's much more information on these different kings. King Shalmaneser on the other side of the Euphrates River built a castle which was named after him, and an Syrian colony was settled there. For this victory that he gained, he offered 1,000 rams and sacrificed etc. to his god Ben. And he made another expedition to Armenia, and he came to the Caspian Sea. From there he conquered everything in his way, as he was going to take captive the king of Giranasir near the lake of Van. Many times, accompanied by great armies, he went to Media and Persia, and he levied on them heavy taxes. But the greatest enemy of the Syrians were the Hittites, who were dwelling on the borders of the Mediterranean Sea to the west of Syria. He defeated the Hittites in the famous city Gemil, where his laws had been rejected. In one of the writings of Shalmaneser, I mention the names of Ahab and Yahud, the kings of Israel, and also the names of Bahidad and Hazael, the kings of Damascus. He made them pay taxes to the Assyrians. He introduced many reforms in his country and built many castles and cities, and he transplanted the inhabitants of Syria to the northwestern part of Mesopotamia, and there he settled Assyrians. He built a temple to the memory of his conquest, etc., etc. And then his son ruled after him. And then there's some queen who was greatly admired by the look of it, Semiramis, or Samuramet, Shamiram, who was very famous universally in the ancient history of Western Asia. There are many traditions told about this queen. She was a princess from Babylon who possessed great beauty and vivacity. In some of his war expeditions, she accompanied her husband, the king. She contributed bountifully towards the decoration of Babylon. She was the wife of Shalmaneser, by the looks of it. After her husband died, therefore she ruled Babylon. Therefore the Babylonian authors wrote her name in the chronology of their kings.